I was not supposed to be in Trauma Bay 2 that night. My job ends at the elevator bank. I wheel the cart, I log the medications, I knock on the frame and leave the tray on the counter and go. But the bay doors were open when I came around the corner at 11:43, and what was happening inside had pulled every person in that corridor to a stop, and I stopped too. They had brought a young Marine in on a backboard at 11:38. I learned the details later, through the broken telephone of nurses' station talk and overheard radios. A civilian vehicle, winter road, black ice, impact at highway speed. 23 years old. 4 months out of the service. His name was Lance Corporal Thomas Vetch, though nobody called him that in the Bay. In there he was the airway, or the pressure, or the rate, the way trauma patients become their failing systems so the team can think clearly. Dr. Harmon was running the room. I had worked at Aldervane Regional for 6 years and I knew Harmon the way I knew the stairwell lights, constant, unremarkable, always present. 15 years as a trauma attending, gray at the temples, calibrated to probability. Not unkind. Simply calibrated. He worked the patient for 12 minutes. His team was good, 2 residents, a respiratory tech, a trauma nurse named Coyle who had been at Aldervane longer than Harmon, and they worked. But the pressures were wrong and getting worse, and the airway was compromised in a way that the standard approach was not fixing, and at 11:50 Harmon straightened up from the head of the gurney and said, in the flat and final tone I had heard him use before, that they had done what could be done. That the injuries were incompatible. That they should make the patient comfortable. The room shifted. That is the only way I know to describe it. Coyle's hands slowed. The respiratory tech stepped back half a pace. The residents looked at each other. Harmon pulled off one glove and reached for the chart. The new nurse did not move. I had registered her when I came to the door, the way you register a filing cabinet, something present and functional and not yet important. She had been at the far end of the gurney, gloved, watching the monitors, quiet. I had seen her once before that night, wheeling a supply cart, and thought she was logistics. A float nurse, maybe. New hire. She said, I need the room. Harmon looked up. I need 2 people and a surgical kit, she said. Standard and a 14 gauge. And I need the room. Harmon is not a man who is often addressed that way in his own bay. He looked at her for a moment, the look of a man recalibrating, and then he said, quietly, that the patient's injuries were not survivable, and that he appreciated her willingness but that the family would be notified and. His airway is deviated, she said. The approach you used won't correct it at this angle. It needs to come from here. She pointed, not at Harmon, but at a position on the patient's neck that I could not have named then and could not name now. I've done it twice. Not in this building. The room was very quiet. Coyle, the trauma nurse, and I will never forget this, because it told me something about what she recognized that I did not, handed over the surgical kit without being asked again. Not to Harmon. To her. Harmon did not leave. I will give him that. He stayed, and he watched, and whatever he saw in her hands in the first 30 seconds kept him from speaking. I have no medical training beyond the pharmacology I need to do my job. What I can tell you is what I saw, a woman who had performed this maneuver before, in conditions I was only going to understand later. Her hands did not shake. Her voice was level and specific. She called the instruments by names Coyle had to translate once, a field term for something the kit labeled differently, and she moved with the economy of someone who has had to move exactly right in a place where wrong was fatal. She worked the airway. She called a pressure number and was right. 7 minutes, no narration, no checking of consensus. At the end of 7 minutes the monitor tone changed. The rate climbed. The pressure held. Thomas Vetch, Lance Corporal, USMC, 4 months a civilian, did not die in Trauma Bay 2 at Aldervane Regional Medical Center on the 14th of December. Nobody in that room said anything for a moment. Then Coyle exhaled, a single long breath, and the respiratory tech moved forward and the residents came back to the gurney and the machinery of stabilization resumed around a patient who was no longer a lost cause. Harmon stood at the edge of the room. He was watching her strip her gloves. She was already moving to the chart, her back to him, writing in the shorthand of someone who has written field notes in worse light than this. He looked down at the gurney tray. She had set the surgical kit back in its tray, and beside it, it must have fallen from her scrub pocket when she reached for the instrument, was a small book. Dog-eared, the cover worn soft, the kind of wear that comes from years in a cargo pocket rather than months on a shelf. A field medical guide. The kind issued to Marine Recon combat medics, not to civilian trauma nurses. He picked it up and opened the front cover. On the inside, in faded ink, someone had written 2 words, warrant. USMC. He looked at her across the room. She did not look back. She was finishing her notes, her pen moving steadily, as if the last 9 minutes had been unremarkable. I was still in the doorway. The medication tray was in my hands and I had forgotten it completely. I went to my cart. I logged the delivery. I did not go home. I sat in the break room with coffee I did not drink and thought about her hands on that airway, and the name in the front of that book, and the tone of her voice when she told Harmon what the problem was. Not angry. Not pleading. Simply correct, the way a person sounds when they have been correct in harder rooms than this one and are not asking permission. 40 minutes later I was walking back toward the pharmacy when I heard the front doors. Not the automatic slide of the emergency entrance. The manual push of the main lobby doors, the heavy brass-handled ones that most people don't use after 9. They opened with a deliberate resonance and I stopped at the corridor junction and looked. 5 men in marine dress blues walked through the lobby. They were not rushing. They moved the way men move when they have decided where they are going and are not uncertain about it. The man in front was perhaps 35, 4 rows of ribbons above his left breast pocket. The 4 behind him were younger, same bearing, 2 of them still wearing traces of a formal event, a retirement dinner, I would learn later, at the VFW hall 6 miles east. The man at the front desk looked up. I watched him take in the 5 Marines and arrive visibly at the conclusion that the protocol for this situation was not covered in his training. "We're looking for a nurse," the man in front said. His voice was quiet and entirely sure of itself. "New to this facility." "She was on tonight." The desk attendant said he would need a name. "We don't have one," the man said. "But she worked at trauma tonight." "A Marine." "Thomas Vetch." I walked forward before I had decided to. I told him I knew who he was asking about. I told him I could take him back. He looked at me for a moment, a measuring look, not unfriendly, and then he nodded, and I led 5 United States Marines down the main corridor of Aldervane Regional Medical Center at 32 minutes past midnight on a December morning. I found her at the medication station off the trauma wing, the small alcove between Bay 1 and Bay 2 where the nurses do their charting between calls. She was at the counter, still in her scrubs, writing. A cup of cold coffee sat at her elbow. She had not gone home either. I said her name, I had learned it from Coyle, finally, an hour ago, Cassidy. She looked up. I said, "There are some people here who would like to speak with you." She looked past me. The 5 Marines had stopped in the corridor, just at the edge of the alcove. The man in front, the platoon commander, I would understand later, looked at her, and something crossed his face that I can only describe as relief. The specific relief of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has now been told they can set it down. "Warrant," he said. It was not a question. She was very still for a moment. Then she stood up from the stool. "Major," she said. He said, "We heard what happened in that bay." She said, "He's going to be all right." He said, "I know. They told us." He paused. "We came because of what you did tonight. And because of what you did before." He glanced at the 4 men behind him, and something passed between them, the shorthand of people who have been in the same difficult places together, and then he looked back at her and said, "We've been trying to find you for 2 years. After you separated, you were just gone." She did not say anything. He said, "Corporal Watts is alive. He wanted me to tell you that in person, but he's in San Diego and he's going to call you. The airway you put in Ghazni, in that street, in the dark with a pen light and no anesthetic, that's the reason he's alive and coaching his daughter's soccer team right now. We never got to say that to you." The corridor was very quiet. The night shift hum of a hospital, monitors, distant wheels, the soft percussion of a building that never fully sleeps, went on around us, indifferent. In the alcove, none of us moved. She said, in a voice that was steady and low, "I didn't know if he made it. I knew the medevac got him. I never heard after." He said, "He made it." She pressed her lips together once. That was all. No tears, no collapse, no dramatics. She looked like a woman receiving information she had been waiting 2 years to receive and had trained herself not to expect. He took one step back. The 4 men behind him, without a word from anyone, came to attention. And then the commander, Major, I never learned his full name that night, brought his right hand up in a salute. Precise, formal, held. The 4 men behind him did the same. She returned it. Clean and exact, the way I imagine you return a salute when it has been 2 years but it is still in your hands, the way a language is still in your mouth when you have not spoken it in a long time, immediately, without searching. I heard a footstep behind me and turned slightly. Harmon was standing in the corridor, 10 feet back, where the trauma wing met the main hall. I do not know how long he had been there. He was still in his scrubs, his coat open, the glove from the earlier case still visible in his breast pocket. He was watching the salute. He did not speak. He did not need to. He was a good doctor, a man who had practiced the arithmetic of survival for 15 years and learned to accept the limits of the math. And now he was standing in a corridor of his own hospital watching 5 Marines salute the woman he had told to step aside, and I watched him understand, fully, without defense, that the limits he had accepted were not the limits of what could be done. They had been the limits of what he knew. He stood there for the length of the salute. When the hands came down, he turned and walked back toward his bay. I did not follow him. I stood where I was until the Marines had finished speaking with her, quietly, a few more minutes, the kind of conversation that has mostly already been said and only needs the presence of bodies to complete it, and then I walked back toward the pharmacy and I sat at my desk in the empty room and did not do any work. I thought about what it must have taken to walk into Aldervane Regional and put your name on a new hire form and take the float assignments and wheel the supply carts, carrying what she had done in places this building would never know about. I thought about a penlight in the dark and a cut made in a foreign street with the right tools missing and the wrong conditions holding, and 2 years of silence after, not knowing if it took. I thought about Corporal Watts coaching his daughter's soccer team in San Diego. I thought about Thomas Vetch, 23 years old, breathing in a room 2 doors down. I have worked at Aldervane for 6 years. I will probably work here for 20 more. I will chart medications and push the cart to the elevator bank and forget most of what I see, because most of what I see is routine and the mind blurs the routine into background after long enough. I will not forget her. I will not forget the sound of that monitor climbing back, or the name in the field manual, or the 5 men in dress blues coming through the lobby at midnight like they had always known exactly where they were going. I will not forget the salute, or Harmon standing in the corridor watching it, or the moment the Major said, "He wanted me to tell you that in person." A goodbye is not always an ending. Sometimes the ones we carry, performed in the dark, in a foreign street, with a penlight and a prayer and no guarantee, come back around. Sometimes they come back through a pair of lobby doors at midnight, 5 men in their best uniforms, looking for the woman who made the goodbye unnecessary. She had delivered hers. And the men she once served came through the door to make sure she knew it.